So in 2022, we decided to do things a little bit differently. We had a soybean intercrop planted between the sweet potato plots. As you can see here, there were 4 rows of soybeans between the rows that had sweet potatoes, and within the sweet potato rows there were 15-foot sections of soybean between individual plots. We did this on the theory that aphids, which transmit the sweet potato potaviruses in a stylet-borne manner, might cleanse their palate by feeding on soybeans or some other unrelated crop moving between sweet potato plots, and thus reduce infection between the plots. This is not proven on sweet potato, but it has been shown to be effective on some potavirus and other crops, and so we decided we would try this and see if we could keep the low generation seed as clean as possible throughout the study. The seed that we used to produce the SWIPs to plant this plot came from different sources. So the G1 seed came from the Sweet Potato Research Station Foundation Seed Program at Chase, Louisiana, and we did not detect any virus infection in the seed used from that source. The G2 seed was saved from the 2021 plot. It was G1 in 2021 and had a very low rate of reinfection in the field during 2021. The G4 seed came from commercial farms. So the Orleans came from farms in northeast Louisiana and had a very high rate of infection. And the Beauregard B63 came from farms in south central Louisiana and had a relatively low rate for something of such an advanced generation. The sweet potatoes in this plot were planted on May 17th, which was about 2 weeks after the soybeans had been planted. Here you can see what it looked like on June 10th, which was an overcast day, which is really ideal for observing symptoms on sweet potatoes of virus infection. So the soybeans were planted about 2 weeks before the sweet potatoes, so we could get them up a little ahead of the sweet potato. And the sweet potato plots each consist of 30 plants in a row. We have this set up in what's called a Latin square design. So we have blocks that have each of the 6 treatments randomized in them, and then also each row has all 6 of the treatments randomized by rep in the row. So if there's any effect at the end of the field, we should have blocked on that. If there's any effect in the row, we should also have that captured. So this is a plot of G3 Orleans. If you recall, it had relatively low level of infection, about 35% in the seed roots that were used. And here, right off the bat, you can see a plant that has fairly obvious symptoms of acute infection, especially this leaf where you can see the yellowing along the veins. So that's typical of a new infection that maybe has occurred within the last week or two, and the virus is moving systemically. Most of the plants in this plot are not showing symptoms. An occasional plant might show chronic symptoms. But overall, I'm not seeing much new infection yet here at 1 month after transplanting, which is just the beginning of the period where we see the peak movement. We're going to show you the roots from 1 rep of each treatment, generation, and cultivar laid out in the field at harvest. So here are the Orleans G2. These had a pretty good number of roots. They were pretty uniform in size and shape. Unfortunately, some of them were just barely large enough to be jumbos. And here are the G3 Orleans. These were very similar to the G2 Orleans, but maybe a little bit less uniform in size. Here are the G5 Orleans. These were smaller and were less uniform in size and shape. Not only in the length and width, but also more roots had bends or slight deformities of shape. And here are the G2 Beauregard B63. Generally, the Beauregard had less uniformity in size and shape than the Orleans, even though the overall yields turned out to be very similar in the G2, with once again a fairly high proportion of roots that were just barely large enough to be graded into the jumbo category. And finally, here are the G5 B63 Beauregards. These had less yield and were much less uniform in terms of shape, with more bends and crooks and somewhat more variation in size as well. And some plots also had more soft rot resulting from the flooding. Here in graphic form is the yield data from these plots. And what you can see very quickly is that there is an unusually high percentage of jumbos in these. We graded these very precisely as best we could manually, and a very high proportion of those jumbos were just barely large enough to qualify as jumbos. So you will also notice there's a very low proportion of canners in these plots, and I think overall what this indicates was there was a fairly uniform set of storage roots on these plants. This was harvested at 117 days. Unfortunately, we could not harvest it any earlier because of the excessive rain we had. Had we been able to harvest it maybe just a week or so earlier, there would have been a much higher proportion of US number 1s. As you can see also, the G2 plants yielded almost 1,000 bushels, 40-pound boxes per acre overall, and there was only a slight decline in yield between the G2 and the G3. But the G5, especially for Orleans, had a much reduced yield, almost 35 to 40%. The reduction wasn't as great for Beauregard, but as you'll see in the next slide, the incidence of virus infection in the Beauregard was not as great as in the Orleans. Here's the data on incidence of virus. Earlier you saw the graph on the left which depicts the incidence of virus in the seed roots that were used to produce plants for these plots. On the right now we've added the incidence of virus at the end of the season. This was collected by collecting 6 number 1 roots from 6 different plants in a plot of 30 plants, so that's a 20% sampling incidence. Nucleic acids were extracted from each of those roots, and they were tested for the 4 podaviruses, also sweet potato leaf curl virus and sweet potato chlorotic stunt virus. Neither of the latter 2 were found in any of the samples. As you can see, and as you might expect, virus incidence increased for each generation of both varieties between the time of planting and the time of harvest. The Orleans started out with a fairly high level of virus infection, particularly in the G4 seed, and by the time of harvest that was nearly completely infected with all 4 viruses. The level of infection in Beauregard was lower. Infection in the G1 for each variety was not found at planting, but did have a low level of infection during the course of the season, despite having the soybeans interplanted amongst the plots. Finding a way to do side-by-side comparisons can really show growers the kind of differences we see, and I think could really help them buy into the clean seed program.